Hello everyone, Mr. Fugay here, and this video is our first video in geometry, which is going to introduce us to some important vocabulary regarding points, lines, and angles. Prior to this video, you should have watched two videos by Math Antics on YouTube, and those should be linked in your lesson plan. Be sure to check those out as they give a more visual context to what I'm going to be discussing in this video. In this video, we're going to go through some important vocabulary that you've seen before and some new ones you haven't, and talk about how we can draw these things, how we name them, and then also how we can name them in different diagrams and such. So let's start with the beginning. Point. Point represents a location. Let me get my pen here. Our location that has no width, length, or depth. When we draw this, quite literally, we just draw ourselves a dot, as simple as it looks, and we're going to label it with a capital letter. So we'll just use the letter A, since that's the first letter of the alphabet, which confirms what we're talking about here. When you're naming the figure in the diagram, you can refer to it as point and then the letters, in this case A, or sometimes we're just going to say A, because a single letter should represent a point in space. Now, once we take those points and we can start creating things with multiple points. So the first one we begin with is a line, which is understood to be something that is straight, and it contains an infinite number of points, and at least two of those points should be defined. So what I mean is, if you take an infinite number of points, look at all those dots I'm putting there, you can make a line with those. But when we're typically drawing lines, we're just going to define 2 points that are on that line. So let's call it, in this case, C and T, and then we're going to draw a line, straight line that connects them with the arrows on the end, and that's going to be super important here, okay? There can be more than 2 points sometimes listed. In this case, I'm going to put a third here, and we'll call it A, for example, and we'll have different ways that we can label it. So a couple different ways is 2 capital letters indicating any 2 points that are on the line with the double arrow line above. So in this scenario, in our drawing here, there's many different ways we could draw this. We could call it C and T, so we're just picking 2 points. We could pick C and A, and I could go on all day with all these combinations of C, A, and T. These are just 2 examples. You can technically do CAT, but we typically don't do that in geometry. A less common way to label lines is actually using a lowercase script if no points are defined, or a different way to draw it. So for example, sometimes you may see a letter down here at the bottom in cursive, either an L, an M, or an N. And in this situation, when we use that alternate naming strategy, we would call this line L. Less common, but it's something you need to be familiar with. Now, lines go on infinitely and they extend forever in both directions, as the definition states here. However, what we can create if we don't want it to extend forever is what's called a line segment. And this consists of 2 endpoints and then all the points in between. So unlike the last example where the C, the A, and the T were points along the line, we're going to create 2 endpoints in this case. I'm going to call it D and G. And then as we connect them, notice there's no arrows. It begins somewhere and it ends somewhere. So we would call this segment DG. Now there can be other points defined on it. There's no rules against that. So for example, I'll put one here called O. See what I did there? Cat and dog. When we label it, this is where we have to be very important. We have to use 2 capital letters, and we must, in this case, indicate the end. That's super, super important versus line where you can pick any 2 points you want. The order of the points do not matter. So in this situation, we want to make sure we put a bar above it as well. So the 2 acceptable names for this segment you see on the left would be DG with the bar above it. Notice there's no arrowheads above it, okay? Or you could call it GD. Those are the only 2 acceptable names for it. So for example, if I wanted to call this OG, this would be incorrect. And the reason that we can't call this segment OG is that is inferring a segment that starts in O and goes to G. And notice that's a completely different segment that is labeling something different that we're not discussing here. A couple more of these basic definitions to wrap up. The next one is a ray, and this is kind of a combination of our first 2 definitions regarding line and line segment. It's a portion of a line that originates at an endpoint but then continues infinitely in one direction. So for example, we have this, and it extends forever one way. So it has an endpoint, which in this case I'll call P, and then it would need maybe a second point along it to just simply tell us what direction we're going in, because we could have multiple rays originating from P. So in this example, let's go ahead and make one G, and oh, since we're on the animal path here, let's go ahead and put a third point and call this I. So this ray has the point, starts at P, and then it contains I and G along it. Now, in terms of labeling this, we would use two capital letters, and one of the most important thing is the endpoint must be one of the 2 points used. It must be the first one used, in fact. And then any other point along the ray could be the second one. The arrow is always going to point left to right, and the end point of the ray must be the first letter. So the 2 acceptable names for this ray here, we could call it PG, and notice the arrow goes left to right, or we could call it PI. These would be 2 acceptable ways to name the ray. You cannot call it GP, for example, even if you switch the arrow the other direction. That is not considered an acceptable. Whoops, what happened there? Redo. I lost the G in there. Let's fix that. Go back to red. Sorry about that. We cannot label it that way. We also can't, for example, call it IG because it doesn't contain the endpoint P. So those are 2 incorrect ways to label a ray. And then the last of the basic terms here is going to be an angle. And so as we're looking at angles here, this is going to be 2 rays that share a common endpoint. And this common endpoint we're going to give the name of vertex. And we're going to see that term vertex used a lot here. And then the actual rays themselves are going to be considered sides. So if I want to draw 2 rays that have the same endpoint, let's go ahead and we'll call this W. And then I'm going to have the first ray, which I'll do in red, go this way. I'll have the second ray blue that goes this way. Along the red and the blue ray, we'll probably have another point here. So let's call it A, W, and then S. I don't know. We got rid of the animals here. I forgot this time. But as we're going to label this now, the key here with labeling an angle is it has to be 3 capital letters followed by the angle symbol, and the middle letter must be the vertex. Other letters will indicate one from each side. So I'm going to actually put a second point here. We'll call this, I don't know, X, just for fun. So let's come up with some ways we can label this. So here are the first 2 ways that I would label it. The vertex W in both cases is going to have to be the middle letter. The first letter should come from the red ray, which in this case is A, and the second one should come from the blue ray, which can either be X or S. So we'll go ahead and call it S in this case. Or we could switch the order and have the blue ray labeled first, then the W still, and then lastly the A. So those are 2 acceptable ways of labeling it. And of course, because the blue ray has 2 point X and S on it, we could alternate that X there instead of the S. So we could call it, for example, AWX. That would be another example of one. Another alternate way for us to label this is just one capital letter, which is going to be the vertex. So in some cases, we may just call this angle W, but this means W is vertex to only one angle. And what I mean by that is if I draw an angle here, let's call this W, and we'll call this A and S. But then let's have another angle over here with J, okay? Notice that W is the vertex both to JWA, which I'm going to use that red arc to label, and then AWS, which is going to be the green one. So because of that, we can't call it angle W, and that's really important to notice there. There's also a less common way, which can be a numeric label. We'll see those in other places, but not necessarily here just yet. So those are some of the basic definitions that you probably already knew, but we wanted to go through some more specifics on it. So for the remainder of this video, we're going to jump through a couple terms that you may not have heard, but use some of the terminology we've already discussed. So let's start with those, and that's these 3 definitions here. The first one is opposite ray, and this is the fact 2 rays that share a common endpoint and whose side lie on the same line. This can be also thought of as what they call sometimes a straight angle, okay, a straight angle, which we'll talk about angle measurements later on in this lesson, but it's an angle that measures 180 degrees. So here's an example. I'm going to use this black point right here, which we'll call F. And then I'm going to draw a ray that is in red here, and we'll put a K here. Okay, so this will be considered right there, and I'll do this in red. This is considered ray FK. Okay, we can also then create a blue ray that goes exactly the opposite way. So directly in the other direction that this is going in, we'll put a point J here, and this is be considered ray, sorry, not JF, got to be careful with that. Remember, it always starts with the end point. So in this case, we would call it FJ, starts at F, goes in the direction of J. These would be considered opposite rays. They have to be going opposite directions from each other. Notice though, it just creates a straight line, and again, a straight line measures 180 degrees. Collinear, another definition here, is a term to describe points that lie on the same line. And so when we do that, for example, I'm going to draw myself a line here, and we'll put some points on here, G, E, O for geometry. All three of these points lie on the exact same line, so what we could say is that G, E, and O are collinear. So if you're asked to create collinear lines, you're simply just going to create a line and plot those points all on that line. And the last of these newer definitions is actually we have two more, I'm sorry, there's adjacent too, is intersection. The point or set of points that two or more figures have in common. And one of the most common intersections you're going to see is that if I have this red line that I'm going to draw here, which we'll use the cursive notation for this one, we'll call this line L, and then I have another intersection here which I'll call, or sorry, another line we'll call line M. The intersection, the overlap of those two things is occurring right there. And where they intersect, we're going to go ahead and put a little dot there, and we're going to call that a point. So let's call that point K. So what we could conclude is that point K is the intersection of line L and line M. So just kind of like if you have two roads that intersect each other, there's a common space that both roads travel over, that's called the intersection. It's virtually the same thing that's happening here in a geometry perspective. The last definition in this video we're going to talk about is adjacent, and adjacent is used a lot here. Adjacent is referring to the idea of next to. So in geometry, we could describe segments and angles as being adjacent to one another, and the key here about this is the term next to. This is how I think about when I think about adjacent. So for example, I can draw this segment here, which we'll call AB here in black. Then the next one I'm going to do is a red segment that goes from B to C. And then the last one is a blue segment that goes from C to D. So what we could say is that segment AB is adjacent or next to segment BC. We wouldn't be able to say it's next to CD, but we could say instead of just BC, maybe we could call it BD instead. Because in this situation, AB and BC have the common endpoint of B next to each other, so that would be considered adjacent. Now, the most common way we're going to label or use the term adjacent is for angles. And so if I draw two angles here, let's go ahead and draw the first one here in black. We'll label the vertex here as A, this side is M, this side is T. So this would be considered angle MAT, and I'll label that with this red arc marking there. And then we could have another angle that goes down here. We'll draw a little blue arc for that, put our last point there, H. And this angle, which we'll call TAH, okay, is going to be considered adjacent. And the reason why they are is they are next to each other. Next to each other. And there we are. There's a few other details we need to be careful with here. For example, they cannot overlap or be on top of each other. So we'll see some of those examples as we work through our practice over the next few class periods. So that'll conclude all the important vocabulary definitions. Look for another short video which will talk about measurements in geometry, and look for that link in your lesson plan files. But that'll conclude the vocabulary lesson. Thank you for watching.